Okay, this is chapter 3, part 1. This chapter is about victimology. And by victimology, we mean a subfield of criminology that specializes in the study of victims, uh, both being victims of crime, what predicts being a victim of crime, understanding the crime from the victim's perspective, and also studying how victims are treated or their experience with the criminal justice system. So there's that part of it too. Always with criminology and the different subfields, you've got the focus on crime, and then you've got the focus on society's reaction to crime and the criminal justice system's reaction to crime specifically. So you've always got those different components. Now, this is a really important field that for decades was neglected. The criminal justice system tends to focus on suspects, um, apprehending and prosecuting, convicting, punishing suspects, um, but tends to leave, at least traditionally, historically, tended to leave the victim out of it because criminal law tends to see crime as an offense against society, against the public, against all people, against the government. But so with that kind of a philosophy or orientation, sort of leaves the victim, the specific victim, out of the crime, and the victim, say, beloved individuals, family members, relatives, that kind of thing. So it's been in recent decades that people have realized that, hey, victims are important in this too, and their viewpoint needs to be considered and respected and taken seriously. And also, the other part of this is that criminologists have seen that we can learn more about crime and understanding crime and how to prevent crime by looking at things from the angle of the victim, as opposed to looking at just the perpetrator. Traditional theories and approaches to criminology try to understand the criminal, what motivates the criminal, what causes someone to become a criminal. That's traditional, that's typical. But you can get a fresh perspective and can learn additional things by looking at crime from the angle of the victim. Because the victim, of course, is part of that story in any given crime. It's that person is an element of the dynamic involved in crime. So that's what we're going to really focus on in this chapter, is crime from the perspective of the victim. Now, there's a few basic things. I do a little bit more focus in this chapter than the author in giving you some rules of thumb, some big picture items that you should know for testing purposes that will help you understand crime better in general with a focus on the victim. So the first point that I have here is the more serious the crime, the lower the chance of being victimized. So if you look at the crime statistics, what you see is that those crimes that are considered to be most minor, where there's the least harm involved, say, for example, teenage, underage use of, on a really minor end, like teenage use of, underage use of alcohol, for example. Now, that's delinquent, that's breaking the law, being too young and drinking alcohol, but that's on the minor end of things. Well, that happens all the time because it's minor. People are willing to break laws quite often if they're minor offenses, if people consider them to not really be a bad thing or not very bad. So as you get moved to more and more serious crimes, you see fewer and fewer of them. So by the time we get up to something really serious, you don't see nearly as many of those types of crimes per year. The most extreme example here would be homicide, murder, where in the United States there's, say, roughly close to 20,000 people murdered per year, which is a lot, is one's too many. But if you compare that to a minor crime, say like that underage drinking, there's millions, tens of millions of teenagers who consume alcohol when they're not old enough tens of millions. That's much, much bigger number than 20,000 murdered. So that is a general rule, and it's really sort of, it makes perfect sense. But what it does reveal is that people are much more tempted by minor offenses because they perceive them as being less bad and also less likely to bring about punishment or less likely to bring about serious punishment. So they don't really see, what that suggests is that people sort of understand, okay, I'm willing to do this because it's not that bad and I'm probably not going to get that much trouble for it. But people, very few people, are willing to say, okay, I'm willing to kill someone, to murder someone, because they believe, they think that it's a horrible thing that you should never do. And they also understand that people who murder get in serious trouble for it. And they probably even sense that a lot of people get caught if they kill somebody, which is true. Most of the time you get caught if you do it. So you can see a certain rationality, a certain sense to that fact. Most perpetrators victimize people who are close and convenient. This is another bedrock finding in criminology, which is that criminals are opportunists. Now, what do we mean by that? Is they commit crimes when opportunities arise. So if you were to leave your car unlocked and the keys in the car, then a criminal might be tempted to steal your car because, oh, look at that, there's an easy opportunity. Unlocked car, keys in there, with just a couple of seconds, I can be taken off with an expensive vehicle, right? Opportunity, an easy opportunity. Criminals are looking for easy opportunities. If you make things really difficult to commit a crime, if that car has a nice modern contemporary anti-theft system, and it's just really difficult to be able to steal that car, well, the criminal's not going to steal it most of the time because you've made it difficult. And criminals are looking for easy opportunities, not hard opportunities where they're much more likely to be caught and they're less likely to be successful because you do something that is able to stop them from committing the crime. So this is a lot of the reason why criminals tend to prey upon people who they live close to, who they interact with, who they see often, because they tend to exploit and take advantage of people who are easy and convenient, people who are close to them. Even their own family members, even their own friends they will victimize, or other acquaintances or associates or co-workers or fellow schoolmates, that sort of thing. The people that they interact with throughout the day are the ones who are most likely to be victimized. So, it's no mystery that, if you live in a high crime neighborhood, that you're more likely to be victimized, even if you're a perfectly law-abiding, decent, respectable, like respectful, polite person who's not looking for any trouble. You're still more likely to get victimized because you bump into criminally prone people more often. And they sometimes are going to take advantage of that convenient opportunity of you being in close proximity to them. So it's just a simple fact. But a lot of these simple facts people overlook and they don't really think of crime this way, but it's absolutely true that criminals are very opportunistic and take advantage of easy opportunities. They don't want to go to extreme lengths and difficulties and take high risks of getting caught if they don't have to. Now, another related finding that sometimes these findings surprise people, sometimes they don't, that most violence, and in this chapter 3, I will focus a lot on violence because it's the most, serious, or at least one of the most serious types of crimes and various forms of violence. Violence tends to be what we call intra-racial or intra-ethnic. And what we mean by that is between members of, typically violence is between members of the same ethnic group. So if you have a victim of violence who's white, the chances are best, the highest, that the perpetrator is also white. If the victim is black, then the chances are high that the perpetrator is also black. So same thing for any other ethnic groups, Hispanics, Asians, etc. That typically the perpetrator and the victim are similar socially, not only in terms of ethnicity or race, but just socially, however you want to look at things. They come from the same neighborhoods, they maybe attend the same schools, they could be family members. Um, so, you tend to interact and hang out with and move in circles with people who are similar to yourself socially. And some of those people may be prone to crime, to violence, to exploiting other people. And back to this point before, that they're opportunists, so they will take advantage of you because you're close and handy. And so because people tend to associate with people who are similar to them, most crime is uh, the victims and the perpetrators are similar to each other. That's certainly true of ethnicity and race. It's true of just whatever you want to focus on. A tendency, same that if you want to look at religion, for example, that there's a tendency for the victims and the perpetrator to have a similar religion, because again, people who are similar socially tend to inhabit the same sort of social worlds. They live in the same areas, attend the same schools, uh, etc. Attend the same churches, etc. So a lot of times we think of hate crimes. We think of these crimes where the perpetrator is one race and the victim is another one. And those sorts of stories, or that image, gets quite a bit of media attention, but that is actually much more the exception than the rule. That doesn't happen nearly as much. It's an exceptional thing when you have people very different from each other, one attacking the other. That's the and a lot of times, it gets news attention because it is unusual, because it's exceptional. If things happen that are very common, then the media doesn't tend to like to focus on those because they're common. They're less interesting because they're what you normally see or what you would normally expect, right? So it's very dicey and not wise, not a good idea to try to get your images of crime, or I should say your sense of reality of crime, from the news, because it's not doing that. The news is not good at giving you a realistic picture of crime. In many ways, that's the case. Okay, now at least with violence, this is another rule of thumb. It doesn't apply to everything, but it's kind of a good rough rule of thumb that can help you understand crime. At least with violence, victim characteristics tend to parallel offender characteristics. So I've already got it at the last point, but let me stress it a little bit more. So if you're looking at serious violent crime, it tends to be perpetrated at disproportionate rates, at higher numbers than what you would expect, by males, by young individuals, either older teenagers or young adults, also individuals who are poor, racial or ethnic minorities. So what we mean by that would be that you wouldn't see this. You have low rates of perpetration of violence by, uh, say the various Asian communities in the United States. You tend to see very low rates of committing acts of violence among those particular minority groups. But if you're talking about Hispanics, for example, or more so an African American community, you see high rates of uh, committing acts of violence in those communities. So that's something, again, that's a tendency that you see. Uh, other characteristics that tend to be correlated with both being a victim of violence and also a perpetrator of crime is being single, as opposed to being married. Married people have lower rates of both being victims of crime, of violence, and also being perpetrators of violence. And people living in large cities, urban areas, tend to be more likely to be victims of violence and also perpetrators of violence. So there's this kind of a certain amount of mirror image between the perpetrators and the victims. And so, this surprises some people. They just, when they're first studying criminology, that you would see that there's a sort of mirror, that the victims have a lot of similar characteristics to the perpetrators. But that's not really a mystery, or not really unexpected if you study crime, because we just talked about how perpetrators take advantage of people who are close at hand, at people who are easy and convenient around them. And we just talked about how people who are socially similar tend to hang out with each other and live next to each other, and, neighbors, and live in the same neighborhoods and communities and that kind of stuff. So really, one of the best predictors that you have committed violence, acts of violence, one of the best predictors of that is that you have been a victim of violence. So victims are much more likely than people who've never been victimized by violence. They're much more likely to also be perpetrators of violence. And also, perpetrators of violence are likely to also have been victims of violence. So these two things tend to run together. Now, there's some important exceptions that we're going to get to in just a second. But as a general rule of thumb, it's a good thing to understand that for example, there's a tendency, maybe sometimes in the media, you might get the sense that there seems to be a lot of attention, or that you see the minority individuals arrested for this violence or that violent crime or that kind of thing. But what's missed in that is that the folks who are most hit and victimized by violence and serious crime are people from poor minority communities. Those are the folks who are victimized by crime at significantly higher rates than other communities and other groups of people. And so, again, these two things tend to run together, and that's important for a criminology student to understand. Now let's get to exceptions. An important exception is that women face higher rates, significantly much higher rates of injurious intimate partner violence. Now that may sound a little, highfalutin or something to bring it. What we mean when we say injurious intimate partner violence, we're talking about boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives, exes, people who are dating, people in that sort of intimate relationship. That you see violence quite a bit in those sorts of relationships, and that the rate of being victimized with injury is much higher for females than it is for males. Now, you'll see here, I'll bring it up now, but it comes up here in a second, is that when it comes to violence, you see studies show that women hit men just as much as men hit women, and that women will throw the first punch or the first act of physical, violence in violence, that they will hit first just as often as a man hits first. So it's not that you don't see violent tendencies from both genders. It's the difference, the huge difference, is that the men tend to inflict much more injury on the women than the women inflicting injury on the man. And the man is much more likely to kill the woman than the woman is to kill the man. So yes, you see violence on both sides, but the injury and the death, the risk of that is much higher for a woman, a female victim. So this is true for fighting, for violence among intimate partners, but it's even more the case that there's even more of a gender imbalance if you're talking about sexual assault and rape, because that's something that's predominantly a male perpetrated crime: sexual assault, rape. So yes, of course, you see cases where women are offenders and perpetrators, but it's small compared to the numbers for men. So men are generally the perpetrators of serious sexual assault and rape, whereas females are much more likely to be victimized by sexual assault or rape. Yes, you have male victims of that too, but not nearly the numbers that you see among females. So this is an example of where the social similarity I was talking about the victims and the perpetrators kind of being similar to each other socially. This is an example where that is not the case. Here you see kind of an opposite. Males tend to be the perpetrators if we're talking about domestic violence, intimate partner violence. That males tend to be perpetrators even more so with sexual assault and rape, and females much more likely to be victims of these types of crimes. So that's a very important distinction from that general rule that we were talking about before. One of the best predictors of being a victim of violence is to be a perpetrator of violence. So we mentioned that one already. The criminally prone tend to move in dangerous circles and are often victimized. This reveals that criminals attack close, convenient targets. So we already covered this ground earlier. Now, we'll this segment's getting a little long, so I'll stop here and I'll pick up next time and begin to talk a little bit about workplace violence.